Hi, my name is Noah Neal. I'm an associate with Key Performance Ideas, specifically with our Cloud Services and Emerging Technologies department. Today I'm going to be discussing attribute dimensions, going to be providing an overview as well as methods through which you can manage attributes and also use of attributes for reporting and for enhancing your reporting. Let's go ahead and talk about the concepts. What exactly are attributes? In Oracle Hyperion Planning and Essbase, essentially attributes are descriptions of the data. That's a very high-level definition of attributes. So we're talking about attributes. You typically mean attributes and attribute dimensions. The two are used interchangeably. In the demo, we're going to actually be showing attributes in the context of Oracle PBCS, Planning and Budgeting Cloud Service. But they originated from the original on-premises tools, Planning and Essbase. These dimensions supplement stored dimension hierarchies, also referred to as the base dimensions. Let's take a look at some of the examples. Typically, Oracle uses an example where a stored dimension is the product dimension, which has color associations like green, yellow, blue, etc. In this particular case, color would be the attribute or the attribute dimension of the product stored dimension, and that color attribute dimension would have values such as green, yellow, blue, etc. Or alternatively, consider a stored dimension like the item dimension with attribute dimension shape that has values like circular, square, rectangular, etc. So you can think of these as characteristics of your metadata. What are these used for? Well, most commonly these are used to group data points for reporting purposes. So for example, consider the previous case here where we had the stored dimension of item and the attribute dimension and shape, and we only wanted to see circular items. Well, we could just pull our attribute value for circular and just report on that subset of items. So essentially you can use attributes for filtering purposes. So it's kind of a high-level overview of attributes, kind of a lot of text here, but let's go ahead and take a look at our application and see how we can manage these dimensions. You can see I'm logged in here currently to the PBCS application, the PBCS environment. I'm going to go ahead and launch the application. Our application is called Plantastic 1. I'm going to go ahead and open up the dimensions here, and I'm in the dimension editor. Let's take a look at our entity dimension, which is actually one of the required planning dimensions. I can access my attributes for this particular dimension by just going over to this icon here and clicking Custom Attributes. You can see I have one set up already for division. So thinking about a specific type of entity where we have an attribute called division and specific values here, maybe a group of our entities is associated with the wireless grouping or the wireline grouping. Let's talk a little bit about some of the constraints for attributes while we're on the screen. For Oracle requirements, level 0 dimension members are restricted to certain data types. So thinking about this further, you can see that we have the data type here for text. If I were to go ahead and create a new attribute value, you can see that I also have different data types available for date, Boolean, numeric, etc. We also would only associate attribute values to sparse dimensions. So for example, entity, company, we mentioned the product dimension earlier, that would be an example of a custom dimension that would be sparse, item, project, etc. Another notion to keep in mind is that you're required to associate attribute dimension values with members at the same level of the stored dimension. So for example, and this would probably be a likely example, we'd be assigning these attribute values for level 0 members, for level 0, say level 0 product members. We can't down the road at that point add an attribute value to a non-level 0 as per the constraint. Let's also make the distinction of attributes versus shared hierarchies, also referred to as alternate hierarchies, also referred to as shared rollups. Let's take a look at one of our stored dimensions here for period. And we have an example here, year total versus total year. And you can see in our year total that would be where our stored members are for January, February, March, and also for quarters, which roll up into year total. Well, let's say we wanted to exclude the quarters, so when we drill in, we can only see the months. We do that using total year, and you can see we have our shared members here. This is a unique parent, and we have excluded our quarter successfully. You can see that's a different layout versus attributes. I prefer using attributes oftentimes just because it might reduce the need for extra maintenance that comes with having these extra members in your stored dimension hierarchy. And there's also might be some implications on calculation time as well. Let's go look again at the specifics here for managing attribute dimensions in the web interface. And this is going to be an example that we're going to use throughout the video, taking a look at the department dimension, again, over here for custom attributes. You can see that our attribute dimension is territory, and that the data type is text. We have specific attribute values. Think of them basically as members under territory for southern, for northern. We can do the same thing that we can for regular members here as far as being able to add a sibling, add a child, etc. We can drill in. You can see we have a parent-child relationship as well, northeast under northern, etc. We can also delete and edit as we'd like. Let's go take a look at how we would go ahead and associate these values to the specific base member. If we go ahead and go back to our dimensions here and take a look at department, we can add them as we'd like. So for here we have FP&A, some custom attributes associated here. And you oftentimes see attribute associations, attribute assignments, attribute tags, all pertain to the same thing, basically adding those attribute values to the member. And you can see here we've assigned the value that is southern to FP&A. We've also done the same for treasury for the sake of our example that we'll dig into shortly. And that's pretty much going to sum up how we manage these attribute dimensions through the web interface. Let's go ahead and take a look at some other methods here. I'm actually going to go into a simplified interface, which is the go-forward interface for planning in the cloud. Go ahead and take a look at application right now, and also at overview. We can actually manipulate attribute hierarchies through jobs. So if we go into dimensions, I can go ahead and actually export this particular hierarchy that is territory as we discussed through the web interface. And you can see that the output is going to be a zip. But once we open it up, we see that it is a CSV file. You can also open this up in Excel. Let's do that for the sake of this example. And you can see that I could just easily add values here as needed, save this format as a CSV file, and actually bring it in through a import metadata job. And I should point out that you could actually automate these jobs as you'd like for should your attribute hierarchy change frequently. Let's take a look at one last method for managing these particular dimensions. That is through the SmartView interface. You can see I have a SmartView login here to Fantastic, our application. Just go ahead and go into Attribute Dimensions, the folder. Go ahead and double-click on Territory, and you can see we have a similar interface here when compared to the CSV file that we were just looking at. I can go ahead and make additions, modifications as needed, and submit that to the database. So 3 methods you can see very similar to managing your normal dimension hierarchies: SmartView, import, export metadata, and of course through the web interface. Let's take a look now at how we would go about using attributes, specifically again through reporting. I'm going to actually start off by looking at forms. Let's just say that I'm an end user. Who is going to be entering in data here. For operating expenses for Uruguay. And let's take a look at our 2 departments that were associated with our territory, attribute dimension, FP&A, and treasury. Let's just say that we're going to enter our travel expenses and rent expenses, say $500 and also $1,000. Go ahead and push that to the database. Let's do the same for treasury as well. Say 1,000 and also 2,000. Go ahead and save that. At this point, we have data in both our FP&A and our Treasury departments, which are actually part of the Southern Territory, as described earlier when we were going through the web interface, the dimension editor. Let's go ahead and take a look at the mechanics of how we utilize these attributes in our form layout. I'm just going to make one adjustment to the form we were just working with. And you can see we have our attribute dimensions available here in our layout. We're actually just going to move this up to page. Go ahead and edit it here. And let's just give the user the option to scroll through their attributes by using a function here, which is descendants. I'm just going to go ahead and save this with attributes. Save it, finish it, and you can see that I have it here. And at this point, I can actually keep my department base dimension static and just filter for our Southern. And you can see that I have the totals as I'd expect here, which are the sums of the inputs that I had for the base dimensions that are tagged with Southern, again, FP&A and Treasury. So it definitely helps being able to send the data, but being able to view the data differently. Let's take a look at how we would do this through SmartView. I'm going to go back to my SmartView grid here and just go ahead and connect to the cube. I'm just going to do some free-form reporting here for the sake of time. And we're just going to build a basic report, basic retrieve. Just typing in the aliases. And then from our data entry screen, we had budget, working, LCU. Department I'm actually going to leave alone, again, because we're actually using our filter that is the territory attribute dimension. Keep going through the other dimensions as well. And you can see I'm not seeing any data. As I would expect, because we have not run an aggregation, we should not be seeing data at the top parent here, that is department. Let's go ahead and insert our filters. I could zoom in to territory and select Southern, but again, freeform, I can just type it in, just regular SmartView technique here. And again, I'm seeing the data that I would expect that's represented by this parent attribute, or sorry, this attribute grouping here that is Southern. You can see how useful that this might be for an administrator and end user who's looking to retrieve the data quickly. You could just manipulate their tags, their attribute values here as needed, and pull the data. Let's take a look at another example for reporting. It's kind of a newer feature for PBCS as well, I should say, is just being able to use attributes extensively in reporting. But let's go ahead and look actually at the Reporting Web Studio, which is kind of a new tool as well, but very similar in function and technical components to the client application for Financial Reporting Studio. I should point out that the interface for this is going to be similar to the data forms layout that we were looking at earlier with the forms. And then we have the option to pull our attributes and point them to whichever axis that we want. Let's go ahead and just make a new report here. And after this, we're going to actually put in a new grid as well and connect to the database. You can see we have our attribute dimensions as described in the designated section here. Again, this is a very simple report for the sake of demonstration. It's going to be similar to our form and our Smart View grid. You can see I have my POV set up here, but I can use member selection if needed to choose the members. I'm just going to keep it as Southern. And I'm actually not going to use the member selection here just for the sake of time again. I'm just going to actually type in the member names as needed. We have travel expenses, and we had rent expenses. We also had FY15. Oops. And working budget. Here again, just going to use the same time frames, January, February, March, and Q1. That should be good. Let's just go ahead and save it right now. In our fantastic reports, we're just going to call this test report attributes. And then we're going to add a header. Pretty simple here. Test report with attributes. This one is going to save it and actually run it. And you can see I have the same numbers again, and I can change the territory if I like. You can see how useful this would be if I had many attribute associations for my department dimension. I could toggle to northern, western, etc. But again, you're pulling the same data as from the other reporting interfaces that we saw. One other point that I'd like to include at this time for working with attributes is actually in Calculation Manager. And here we can actually use a function that is at attributes to actually isolate specific members that are associated with a particular attribute value. So let's just take a look at one of our pre-built examples. Here, essentially, I'm just calling out at attribute the southern attribute value. And basically, here we're just aggregating for South America. If I were to go ahead and run this right now, you can see it's just like any other calc, but we have the specific function that leverages attributes. I could just go ahead and check for South America. And I have the data that I would expect. So in conclusion, attributes are useful for filtering data through a number of different tools. Since the July 2016 release, attribute reporting is possible through PBCS and is very useful for advancing our reporting techniques. Attribute dimensions and associations can be managed in similar methods that are applicable to managing base dimensions, store dimensions, through the web interface, as we saw, and also using CSV files in the import-export metadata jobs, and also through SmartView metadata management.